Welcome to Political Perspectives. I am Hugo Gurdon, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Examiner, and I'm joined as usual by Byron York, our Chief Political Correspondent. Since we last met and talked, Byron, there's been a second attempt on Donald Trump's life. There's lots of unanswered questions, such as how was it that the assassin could be there for 12 hours waiting before he was actually seen and intercepted. What isn't in question is that now the Republican nominee has been targeted twice for killing. I want to talk about the reaction to this and the left trying to say that somehow or other Donald Trump is to blame for this because of his rhetoric. And I would like us to look at a clip of J.D. Vance's response.
But you know the big difference between conservatives and liberals is that no one has tried to kill Kamala Harris in the last couple of months, and two people now have tried to kill Donald Trump in the last couple of months. I'd say that's pretty strong evidence that the left needs to tone down the rhetoric and needs to cut this crap out.
So Vance pointed out that there have been no similar incidents going the other way. And this was immediately cited by the left as a kind of incitement to go after Kamala Harris. Is this a cynical attempt to spread blame or a complete lack of awareness on the left? What is this?
Well, I think it is something you have to be very careful talking about. And if I were J.D. Vance, I wouldn't be pointing this out in the sense that I don't know what the threats are toward the President of the United States or the Vice President. I'm sure there's a lot of them out there, but we do know that these two incidents have actually gotten as far as the presidential candidate Donald Trump being shot in one of them, and with the other an assassin lying in wait for 12 hours, as you mentioned. Listen, I think that Trump has a point when he talks about the rhetoric on the left. And it's not just the threat to democracy, the existential threat that Trump poses allegedly to our way of life. It's been going on for a long time, talking about him as a Russian asset,
right,
Putin's agent, all the way through. And I think what you have to worry about is that when an unstable individual, as the would-be assassin in this latest case certainly seems to be, who, by the way, is obsessed with a political issue, the war in Ukraine.
Right.
And I think he thinks that Donald Trump becoming president would be a terrible thing for what he wants to see in Ukraine. I think you have to worry about the effect that that kind of rhetoric has on a nut like him.
Right. I wonder, this is perhaps a very difficult question to answer about whether or not the rhetoric on one side is worse than on the other. It's perfectly clear that both former President Trump and President Biden have both used some kind of violent rhetoric. They've both suggested, Trump has suggested, beat someone up if they're trying to do something. Biden has said, if he were in high school, he'd go and he'd beat Trump up behind the woodshed, etc. So there's a certain amount of violence in the rhetoric on both sides. But it is only, I think, there may have been some threats, but the President Trump has been targeted twice by an assassin. Back in 2017, the Republicans were targeted by a guy who shot up a baseball field, very, very nearly killed Chief Whip Steve Scalise. Is the rhetoric actually worse on the left, or is it just a coincidence that the murderers or would-be murderers have come from the left?
I think that what we've seen from Trump's opponents has led to a kind of a logical progression, which is he's in office. You obviously try to defeat him in the election. In 2016, they couldn't do that. Then you began to investigate him, and then you impeach him. Then he is defeated in 2020, and you hope to, there was an effort after he left office to impeach him so that he would be disqualified from ever holding federal office again. Then you file all sorts of lawsuits trying to destroy him financially, and then you charge him criminally with the hope of putting him in jail. All of these are done with the hope of making sure that he cannot run and win the presidency in 2024. And it leads you to kind of a conclusion like, if all of that doesn't work, what's left?
Right.
So here you have that progression, and it's natural in people's minds. And believe me, Republicans have thought about this for at least a year, that, you know, they're throwing everything they have at him. And if it doesn't work, what's next?
Right. I want to come back to the repeated lie, most recently in my memory at least, repeated by Kamala Harris in the debate against Trump, relating to Charlottesville. A left-wing protester was killed by the driver, a right-winger, who was in a car. He drove into a crowd and killed somebody. After that incident, President Trump talked about it, as you would expect. It was there were neo-Nazis there. There were also people who were simply trying to save the Confederate statues from being pulled down.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. And I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists.
Ever since then, because President Trump used the phrase, there were good people on both sides, or words to that effect, and he specifically and explicitly excluded the neo-Nazis from that. He said, I'm not talking about these people. Nevertheless, the lie has been repeated again and again and again. So there is an attempt, it seems to me, to try and present President Trump and the Republicans as somehow endorsing the most extreme kind of people. And yet, back in 2020, people like Kamala Harris and indeed Nancy Pelosi really supported the riots in the streets after the death of George Floyd, in which people were shot and killed. So there seems to me a false equivalency here. Where Charlottesville and the neo-Nazis is nothing like as close to orthodox opinion within the Republican Party as supporting street violence and in which people have been killed is orthodox for the Democratic Party.
Kamala Harris actually helped raise money to defend and free the people who've been jailed in these deadly riots in Minnesota and elsewhere. You know, the Charlottesville thing, it really falls under the heading of some stories are just too good to check out. And it has become, and the point you have made, first of all, it's supported by a transcript. I mean, Trump said these things with microphones and cameras around, so you can watch him and listen to him say it, and then you can read the transcript. You can see that. And yet somehow this persists. Joe Biden predicated his entire presidential campaign on it. He said that Joe Biden, had left the vice presidency in 2017, and he was going to kind of kick up his feet and have a nice life, and then he saw this Charlottesville stuff, and he knew he had to run for office to save American democracy from this man. So this is something with apparently that's a permanent feature of our politics now, and it doesn't matter how many times you say, look at the video, read the transcript. It doesn't matter. It has become the story.
I think that beneath the rhetoric and the accusations of equivalency, actually everybody knows that there's more violence comes from the left. Apart from anything else, of course, it's sort of orthodox leftism that violence is part of the struggle. I mean, it goes right back to Karl Marx, etc. But you know, in 2020, the election obviously took place about 6 months after George Floyd was killed. Coming up to the election in Washington, the storefronts were boarded up.
They were.
The streets were deserted. The store owners in Washington were not boarding up because they expected the right to riot if Joe Biden won. It was because they knew the left would take to the streets and be violent, smash things, if their guy didn't win and if Trump actually was re-elected. So everybody actually knows that the violence is mostly on the left, do they not?
Well, that is exactly what happened in Washington, and it was remarked upon at the time that all these places were boarded up because they were afraid of a Trump victory and what would happen after that. And we had seen a number of violent demonstrations in Washington prior to that. As a matter of fact, Antifa demonstrators had actually moved into neighborhoods of Washington where they'd never gone before to try to make people uneasy there. So it was really something that was quite real. And now, obviously, what you have is after the election, and then on January 6th, you have a pro-Trump mob, violently going after the Capitol. I think, 1,200 people have been charged in that now. So it has been kind of a terrible progression. But you're absolutely right. When Trump was in office, the real fear was the left.
So final question, I want to switch somewhat, but it's connected with this. President Trump has now been the subject of at least a couple of assassination attempts. There have been other security scares that I want you to talk about. But Trump has been tied up in court, the whole lawfare stuff. Trump has now, had a couple of attempts on his life. How much is this restricting his campaigning?
A lot. You were making reference, there's a story in the Washington Post about other security incidents that we haven't heard about as far as Trump is concerned. A couple of weeks after it was July 13th, assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. Trump is holding a rally. There's 20,000 people there. They're all ready to hear Trump, and the Secret Service is absolutely frantic. It appears that one person has gotten into the crowd outside the magnetometers. They don't know who this guy is, where he is. They keep Trump in a holding room for more than an hour as the crowd kind of waits and waits. And if you go to a lot of these rallies to cover them, a lot of times there is odd timing about this.
Right.
Sometimes they come out early, and sometimes there's a long wait. Well, in this case, it was a security wait. There was another event out west that Trump held, not a rally, but a kind of a press conference and televised remarks, where Trump was warned that it wouldn't be really safe to be standing in this open area. So he stands there for a little while and then leaves. I think it's more serious than crimping his style. I think if you add the lawfare campaign and now the assassination attempts, you have Trump on the one hand being stuck in a courtroom for a very long time, and also being financially drained by defending himself all of this time. And now you have him, in many ways, hunkered down to avoid assassination. And it is, they'll say they're keeping their schedule the same, but it is, I think, shrinking the schedule a bit. This is really an extraordinary effort to keep him from being president. And believe me, if he actually wins the presidency, and then there's a transition period, there will be huge efforts to try to keep him from assuming the presidency in January 20th of 2025.
Yeah, well, it's extraordinary to contemplate. I think the aftermath of the first shooting was obviously the debate, the implosion of President Biden, his replacement by Kamala Harris. Somehow an assassination attempt against a presidential nominee faded into the background. Now there's been another. It's going to have ramifications right through the election, and as you say, perhaps beyond it. Those are subjects we'll come back to. Byron, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Political Perspectives.